Welcome to Roads Less Traveled, the podcast where real estate, rail trails, and bike tourism meet. I'm Craig Della Penna. I'm a realtor with a passion for turning former railroad corridors to thriving trails and communities. If you're curious about buying homes near these trails, starting a bed and breakfast, or simply want to learn about the incredible opportunities along these greenways, you're in the right place. Every 2 weeks, I'll share stories, expert advice, and conversations with guests who know the ins and outs of rail-to-trail living and tourism. Ready to explore a unique slice of real estate and adventure? Let's hit the trail. Hi, Bruce.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Our new guest is Bruce Donald, who is the Southern New England manager for the East Coast Greenway Alliance, and he's based in Farmington, Connecticut, overseeing greenway development, advocacy, volunteer coordination across Connecticut, Rhode Island, and eastern Massachusetts. He served as the president of the Farmington Valley Trails Council for 12 years and was appointed chair of the Connecticut Greenways Council in 2014. In recognition of his trail advocacy, the Connecticut General Assembly issued an official citation honoring his contributions in 2016. Bruce also brings deep financial and consulting experience from nearly 2 decades in investment, management, and banking across Massachusetts, Boston, New York, Hartford, and even Beijing. An avid cyclist and published historian, he authored a Civil War era book based on his great-grandfather's letters. I want to thank you for coming on here today, Bruce. I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and we're going to be talking about a number of things about regional trail connectivity, advocacy partnerships, government and agency partnerships, trail funding in uncertain times. We've got a lot to cover here. And so let's get underway. Let's talk about this. Why regional connections matter for mobility, recreation, and community health. That's an interesting point right off the bat here. What do you think?
There's a lot of components to that. And by the way, thank you so much for having me here today. If we weren't being on a podcast here, we probably still would be talking about the same stuff. Yeah, I know. We're very much like-minded after 30 years of knowing each other doing this work. This issue of connecting communities, which I think ultimately is really what we're talking about, is critically important. You can go, let's talk about the Mass Pike, which is a big artery of trucks and buses and cars. And we've all been on it. We all know where it goes. And while you're using it, you're not interacting with the community. And I think that's the key difference in discussing bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, is the fact that you are viscerally connected to where you're walking and biking through. And as a through route, suddenly now you're viscerally connected to the next community and the next community and on throughout the whole corridor, right? And suddenly you have a lot of opportunities that don't exist on an interstate highway. You've got tourism. You've got very real issues of linear parks, of just being out and accessing parcels of land that you would not ordinarily have been able to do. Oh boy, the list goes on and on. I could talk about that for hours. But so that's what immediately comes to mind when I think about this. Yeah.
What about the East Coast Greenway? How does that help in linking local projects to a national vision and inch by inch, or how's it going with that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, of course. So that's my day job, of course. The East Coast Greenway is published at 3,000 miles from Key West to Calais, Maine. It's a little less than 2,900, in fact. It's, oh gosh, the last I knew, 2,863. It changes like every other minute, as you can imagine. But I bring that up because a good bit over 1,000 miles is completed in 15 states in the District of Columbia. In the Northeast, as you can imagine, it's more completed than in the Deep South, for instance. And I think that the components that originally came into play 30 plus years ago, when this was envisioned in New York City, was an urban Appalachian Trail concept where
cities.
Yeah, connecting cities instead of connecting little burgs out in the middle of nowhere. And I think that this idea of connecting populations, let's call it that, not even cities, but populations, where you've got in many of these inner cities and many of these capital cities, 35% of the folks living there don't own a car. And so how are they getting around? They're using transit. They maybe own a bike and not a car. So it's a little bit of a different subset of what I think many of us in the United States think about in terms of transportation, where we've got these, to use planner speak, alternative transportation corridors out there in these urban centers. And if you look at counter data, user data, you're looking at kind of 70% pedestrians, 30% bicyclists in urban areas, and the exact opposite in rural areas. Yeah. And so that's really when we at the East Coast Greenway think about our constituents. I think that's how we think about that is connecting all these people together in these places. And it's really starting to come together, certainly in the Northeast, just as well as I do. Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, now New Hampshire, with a big piece done just recently, somewhere between 60 and 85% complete. And we're getting to a point where major trail systems, the Farmington Canal Heritage Trail, which I've been working on for decades, comes to mind. We could have that done in 5-6 years, that whole trail. So yeah, there's a lot to crow about. And I would say the only thing that sticks in our minds are some of the states where we are not that far along, where it is difficult to do this. Georgia comes to mind. South Carolina comes to mind. Parts of Florida, where you've got real issues and something we were just talking about earlier, population density, tax base, the ability for a state DOT to come out and say, yes, we'll build this bike trail, even though it's in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So that's the background for the East Coast Greenway. And we're at, I think, 17 employees now, a little under $4 million in annual budget. We've come a long ways in the last 30 years.
And you mentioned just rolled off your tongue, will be done in 5 or 6 years on the north-south corridor from New Haven towards Massachusetts. That just struck me as funny because I know that, have you ever heard of the concept of 3 stages of truth?
Sure, yes.
I'll tell for our audience here, that was a concept that was invented or discovered by a German philosopher whose name I forgot right now. But it's an actual thing. The first stage of truth is people will scoff at the idea. They just can't believe it and they'll laugh it off. Oh, that'll never happen. The second stage is where they become serious dead-ender opponents, almost fighting to their last breath against that idea.
Yep.
The third stage is where we are now, largely. The hard-bitten dead-ender opponents are largely gone away. There's still a few pockets here and there. But the third stage of truth now is, they say, particularly in my world, when I'm a realtor and people ask, what did you do? And I said, I was involved in all the rail-to-trail wars. What do you mean people were opposed to those? And the concept is, the third stage is, who could be opposed to that idea?
Yeah.
Which means that here we are. You say, 5 or 6 years. People would say, what do you mean it's going to take another 5 or 6 years to do? You've been on it for 30 years and you can see the goal line. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's only 5 or 6 years away, which in our world, it seems like just tomorrow. Other people, they say, another 5 years.
Craig, people come to me all the time, as you can imagine. They come to you too and say, I want to build a bike trail. I say, fabulous. I love that. I'm so glad you want to do that. Please understand that you need to put on your calendar the next decade.
Yes.
And you won't have a trail then, but you probably will have a project in about 10 years. The timelines are terrible. Yes. It's large scale capital projects of this type that aren't government mandated types of projects are just very slow.
Plus, it was a newfangled idea way back when. The fastest rail trail ever built in Massachusetts, when I did my first book, I was going to include it in my first book because it was getting underway, but people inside the Transportation Secretariat DOT in Massachusetts told me, oh, you can't put that into a rec trail book. We're going to make it into a railroad. We can't allow that. And so that trail, I took it out of my book. It's called now today the Ashawiltocook Trail. From the time I took it out of my manuscript and the book was published without it, a few months after my book came out, the local state senator back then, Jane Swift, this is in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, and the trail, now open, it became the fastest rail trail ever built in Massachusetts. 6 years. That was the fastest. The one I'm reassembling now across the state, the 100-mile trail, that's been underway for 45 plus years.
Oh, absolutely. And that's much more common. Yeah.
Let's talk about the current highlights and challenges in southern New England. What's the good and the bad and the ugly going on?
The good is, I think, a lot of established corridors are getting completed. And that has a lot to do with, I think, a recognition at our state DOTs that alternative transportation / connectivity is a critical component of transportation funding. And that really is only in the last decade, as you and I have lived this over the years. Really, more than 10 years ago, that was still a push. That was not an easy thing to accomplish internally at a DOT. I think a lot of engineers had to retire. Seriously.
Right. The 20th century people had to be shown the door.
I really think that's part of the scenario that we're talking about here. But having said that, so established corridors. So I'm talking about the Canal Heritage Trail, things like, your trail, Central Mass Rail Trail, there's North-South Trail, border to Boston, going up into New Hampshire. There's Cape Cod Rail Trail. There's, in the eastern part of Connecticut, we've got the Charter Oak Trail, the Airline State Park Trail. In fact, I'm the incoming president of the Airline State Park Trail Alliance, which is a 12-town alliance of essentially trail towns. Those are state park trails, so a little bit of a different scenario in terms of building those. But rails and trails, same type of corridor system, just a little different management involved. And then we've got, I guess, the elephant in the room, let's call it that, which is the east-west connector from New York State into Connecticut, which still doesn't really exist. It exists on paper and, in fact, in real life, on the ground as the East Coast Greenway on-road route from essentially through Greenwich, all the way through Fairfield and up into West Haven, Connecticut, about 40 miles. And that is the current signed on-road route of the East Coast Greenway. Other than that, there are only...
The route number? What's the state route number of that?
It doesn't really have one. It most closely aligns with Route 1.
Okay.
But it's really cobbled together facilities. There are some off-road pieces. There are more and more bicycle lanes along existing roads. There are a number of ongoing routing studies happening down there. Greenwich and Stamford come to mind. They've got a Connecticut Rec Trails grant. Norwalk is going for one. Fairfield is going for one. So there's some active movement there because the East Coast Greenway had thought that the off-road routing in Western Connecticut was going to be the currently still, after 30 years, non-existent Merritt Parkway Trail, which had $1.5 million study done by Connecticut DOT, which they decided they didn't want to publish because it came up with, at the time, this is over 10 years ago, a $250 million price tag for 37 miles. And people saw the price tag and they said, wow, we're not doing that. apart from the fact that the Merritt Parkway doesn't go through the towns that would be involved in this project. And no one likes that either.
Oh,
So I'm in a situation where we're looking at, again, that on-road route through Fairfield County, the shoreline route, essentially is what we're calling it. And also the Sound Shore communities in New York, going into New York City, and the potential for hooking up with the relatively newly completed Empire State Trail in New York State at Brewster, New York, through Danbury, Connecticut. And we're looking for a study published, I should say funded, and not published, by Connecticut DOT, starting hopefully as early as next year, to look at routing through places like Newtown and the Larkin State Bridle Path and some things that are already done going west and connecting with the Farmington Canal Heritage Trails. But that's ongoing. That is something that's probably, if you looked at the entire Northeast, that's probably the biggest gap.
yeah, I would agree. What we're doing with the North-South Trail report between, well, it's New Haven to Northampton, we're doing a report about what the impact would be for that trail getting finished in the context of it connecting with the Massachusetts East-West Trail so the numbers will show Mass DOT like a booster rocket or second stage rocket to bring impact to the overall East-West Trail to show them that this is going to be worth the time and money to finish the trail. But we'll also got a look at the Merritt Parkway Trail, if it ever got built, tying together those communities and their demographics, how they situate today, and likely number of users tying into the North-South Trail. What would that mean? And so that would be something that would start the conversation for whatever it's worth. But nonetheless, I like to have reports that show usage of trails because it's important. DOTs need to be shown that these are impactful things. And New York, when the governor of New York was shown what the Erie Canal was producing when it was only quarters built, so impactful that he commissioned DOT to build 400 more miles of these paths, creating what is now known today as the Empire State Trail. And that's lifting the tide of everyone else in the region in the Northeast to do this stuff.
Yeah, the Erie Canal economic study was quite the eye-opener at the time.
Yes, that was 10 years ago, too.
Yeah, people looked at that study and said, oh my God, okay, I get it now. I understand. A couple of things there, empirical data. I was one of the catalysts. I can't say I was the only catalyst, but certainly the initial funder of the Connecticut Trail Census, which is now being run by UConn, a very successful program of trail counters across the state of Connecticut, real year-over-year empirical data of usage. I would urge every state in the union to do something like this. It's critically important for our communities that want to get some grants. It's just as critically important to justify capital improvement budgets. These trail projects, we were just talking about this too, are getting more and more expensive, particularly as we're doing bits and pieces that were the hard pieces, that we didn't do it. We did the easy pieces and now we're doing the hard pieces. They're expensive. None of this is cheap anymore. And so if you've got data, if you've got empirical, academically rigorous data, you've got something in your back pocket that is truly usable. And you're working on this. I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't need to.
This is going to go out widely, Bruce, and there'll be people that are not really that familiar with this stuff like we are, and
yeah,
they'll be amazed to learn this stuff. But the good thing about that Connecticut Trail Census, and people, if you go to Google and just put in Connecticut Trail Census UConn, it will pop up and it'll astound you how complete and thorough and ongoing year after year, and it shows the trends and the improvements. And it calls forth the little argument that says inside DOTs, if you don't count, you don't count. If you don't count trail users, you're not going to count when it comes to time to get funded for projects. You have to show the usage and how comprehensive it is and impactful. And
I would argue it's even worse than that, Craig, because if you don't have that data, how are you actually going to compile a legitimate return on investment?
that's
The
right.
answer is the answer is you can't. So
That's why
you can fake it, but you're not gonna. It doesn't work unless you have data.
the reason we're pulling together this report about the North-South Trail, because it's actually a two-phased thing. You have to show how many people are using the trail, and then you can go through specific models to calculate what it would be worth if the whole trail was finished and extrapolating the numbers of projected users. So you have to have user counts, and then you have to have these supportive, supposed magicians, let's call them, that can calculate the impact for those users. Yukon Stores is hidden in plain sight. All this data sitting there in a public facing website with all the calculations and true numbers, just sitting and waiting for someone to come along and extrapolate that data to show in a report what it's going to be worth to those communities. Brilliant idea. So we're on it, Bruce. A few more weeks and that report will be done.
Yeah, everyone's excited about that. In fact, shameless plug for you, but also for Bike Walk Connecticut. You're going to be talking at the annual meeting of Bike Walk Connecticut. Cambridge Econometrics is going to be there.
Yep.
People are very excited about this. We haven't had a major economic study done for bike ped in Connecticut in, I want to say, 20 years. It's been a long time. And best practices have changed. The data, as you say, the data streams, many of which didn't exist back then, are real. And now there's a lot of people who are very excited about this.
That's right. Me too. I don't sleep at night waiting for this report to come out. Yes, this is big. Let's talk about funding and uncertain times. We're in uncertain times. I just saw another little blurb about another federally funded improvement in, we call them gateway cities in Massachusetts, the old industrial centers that were the work was created in prosperousness in southern New England. And there's a federal grant that was just pulled back. And let's talk about how state and federal funding landscapes are evolving. And I know that you've been involved in created solutions and partnerships that keeps project moving, and the importance of local advocacy in securing those resources.
It's a big topic. I've been to some national symposiums that just talk about that. But I will say a couple of things about that. First of all, I believe that there's a bottom-up strategy and there's a top-down strategy. And I think they both need to occur, not necessarily at the same time, but they need to at some point hit in the middle, right? The bottom-up strategy is very simple. I think that, and by the way, much easier than it used to be, as you and I know. I think many communities look at other communities that have a trail system already built or some sort of bike ped facilities, and they have what I call trail envy. They look at these projects and go, oh my God, why do we not have this? And I totally get it, but there's a variety of factors involved in this. That one of which is that the community can say we want this, but their elected officials can say, no, we're not doing that this year. There's another component to this at the local level, which is that you really do need buy-in by your municipal employees, by your engineer, your planner, your local elected officials on the ground. It's really quite important because you can get to the point where you've got, say, a feasibility study for a project. And that backing is critical when you go to some of the initial money. And the initial money still tends to be mostly federal. It's mostly the TAP program, the TA program. There's some other federal pieces of money out there, buckets of money. It's primarily 80% federal, 20% local when you're using it for construction. And then there's other programs out there, and I'll just take Connecticut and Massachusetts because they both have state bonding initiatives that have been enormously helpful in doing things like particularly project origination, which is one of the most difficult components of this in most states around this country, which is trying to find money to do feasibility and the first 20% of design. That money's hard to find. In many states, it's crippling to find. Connecticut and Massachusetts have a luxury of having the Connecticut Recreational Trails Program, which is $10 million a year. And Massachusetts has a very similar program run through DCR that has a similar amount of money as well. And suddenly you can, every year you can go and say, you name the little town, but we would like a feasibility partial design study for the Mass Four Rail Trail. And boom, in 18 months, 2 years, you've got something that you can now peddle to the state DOTs for construction money. Mm-hmm. So that is really concise. It's much more complicated than that, but that's the really concise methodology. And I mentioned top down is, and it's no surprise, the money bags in this tend to be state DOTs, because the state DOTs are siphoning the Federal Transportation Act money down. It's filtering down. And so you need to get on your local MPO's list for the TA program. You can't start the political process for construction money early enough, in my opinion.
Part of the rationale there is that once you have the plan in place, but you haven't identified a funding source, it's still critically important to get the plan in place and have that plan sitting on the shelf, because someday you don't know when or where and how it's going to happen, but the money will appear. And lots of times it's for shovel-ready projects
Yes.
Planned and designed, but sitting on the shelf. And we can look back to the Great Recession, like 2009 and 10, when just locally here, I know that the feds told DOTs around the country that they wanted at least 3% of their projects that were going to get funded during this big disgorgement of federal dollars to re-jumpstart the economy. They wanted a slice of that to go to bicycle pedestrian projects. They had to be shovel ready, that term, that jargon, shovel ready. And so they searched long and hard here in Massachusetts for shovel ready projects to make that metric of 3%. And there were 4 that they found. 2 were in Northampton, Massachusetts.
Fascinating. That's interesting.
They were already funded. One was the big bridge and the build out of the disconnected dead railroad that led to the bridge going over Route 10 on the south corridor in East Hampton and Northampton, Massachusetts. Another project was a way to connect an elementary school in Northampton on one of the earliest municipally built rail trails in New England, one that goes past my house here near the Jackson Street School. The kids wanted to bike to school. They had to schlep their bike up a steep embankment to get to it up at grade. And so the federal funding paid for a switchback to get up the grade. And then in Northfield, Massachusetts, on the borders with Vermont and New Hampshire, the only Massachusetts community on both sides of the Connecticut River, Northfield, there was in their east side of Northfield, there was a sidewalk that was about a mile long on each side in this beautiful historic village center, but the sidewalk was atrocious in ruins. And so the federal dollars paid for the rebuild of the sidewalk to help jumpstart like an outdoor third place element in Northfield. And so those are, I forgot where the 4th one was, but it was somewhere in Eastern Mass. Do you remember back then, Bruce, what were the communities that got funded by Connecticut DOT?
It is so funny you mentioned that, because it brought back memories of that period. So communities that had shovel-ready projects, and I think there were 5 in Connecticut, if I am not mistaken, one of which was downstate, but two were in my primary area of work at the time. Avon, Simsbury, and Farmington had project documents for their remaining build out of the Canal Heritage Trail. And it was a no-brainer. They got the money instantly. It was easy to do. It was well known by DOT. And then another piece that was done was also in Cheshire on the Canal Heritage Trail. And they were there. It was easy to do. But you bring up an excellent point about having documents in your back pocket. I think it's something, and one of the problems is that politically, it never seems to elected officials to be terribly expedient. They don't want to be waving around a piece of paper. They want to be at the ribbon cutting. And
Right.
so it's not a big turn on to an elected official to say, oh, let's spend $60,000 on something that's going to sit gathering dust. That's a tough sell.
Here's another example of that, having the report written and on the shelf. There was, and I know it around the edges, the story, but I know the heart of the story. It had to do with New Haven when the design of the trail, of the North-South Trail coming through New Haven, went through the campus of Yale University.
Oh,
And
yes.
the president at that time, I don't remember the fellow's name, but he was given a report and he was lukewarm to the idea. And it sat on the shelf. And then several years later, he retired. A new president comes, he discovers this on the shelf in his office. And he picks it up and said, let's start this project and make this happen. It's going to bisect our campus. I love the idea. In fact, let's change our planned engineering school, new engineer. Let's turn it around and face the trail. And tell me more details about that story. That's a beautiful story. I forgot it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's 100% true. As a capital project, Yale University had always envisioned a multi-use trail running through its campus. What the first administration you were talking about was balking about was the cost, which doesn't surprise anyone. The last piece of that puzzle fell into place earlier this year. There was a massive ribbon cutting. Many people were there. Rosa DeLauro was there, of course, the long-term congresswoman, and many other folks for the last mile of that trail going right into the center of New Haven at Worcester Square. And a very expensive piece of trail, $14 million for a little less than a mile.
It was in a tunnel.
It's a lot of it is a tunnel. Yes. Yeah, it had to be a tunnel. It goes alongside the FBI building, goes underneath a couple of major buildings, comes out at the top of another project that is being constructed right now as we speak, the State Street cycle track, which is going to go down and essentially complete the entire trail down to the shore in New Haven. That's $6 million in DECD money, of all things. So the Department of Economic and Community Development put their money where their mouth is in the state of Connecticut and actually wrote a check for that piece of trail. But I bring that up because that now completes Yale. It's been enormously successful. Yale wanted, as Yale has asked for before, what are called blue boxes, safety boxes for their students along the trail amenities, a variety of different things, but quite a few benches and such, 24/7 lighting. It's a world-class facility. And it was a combination of things. I think ultimately the students, in fact, I had a lovely interview with the student paper earlier this year. The students just adore it. And I think ultimately it was students and alumni coming back and saying, why aren't you finishing this trail? But it's an interesting story because that interim time period was close to a decade.
Yes.
It was quite a long time. That piece going down to the engineering building, and they did indeed move the new engineering building so that it was right next to the trail, which I just love. It's got the whole front of it has got bicycle facilities, bike racks. It's pretty neat. Yeah.
That's great. What makes an effective trail advocacy partnership? And how do volunteers and community groups move projects forward? What's your experience in Connecticut there?
It's as I mentioned before, and I won't go over my words there, but you need a local vocal constituency.
Local vocal, I like that.
You just they got to be there. They got to be at the town meetings. They got to be at the finance meetings. They got to be at the zoning board meetings. It's pretty critical to the process. I think that whenever a community is being asked, even in some cases when they're not being asked, to come up with money, for a project, there needs to be a vocal response and people that are out there banging the drum for this. I think where some of the disconnect lies in this process, and I think this is what your actual question is, who's out there that can direct those people, those local people, to information, to like-minded politicians, to engineering groups within DOTs, to the planning contingent at their local MPO. And that's where people like me come in, where I basically know all these folks now. And so as a practical matter, I can say, okay, you want to build, you're in New Milford. You want to build a part of the North-South Trail on the Route 7 corridor. Fantastic. Here's a couple of people you have to talk to. Here's the planner at Westcog. Here's et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that there's a role for, I don't know, what would you call me? An enabler? Something along those lines.
We'll call you the Rain Man.
Yeah, something. But there's no question that there's a role for certain groups. And there are certain groups that help in our states. Mass Bike comes to mind, Bike Walk Connecticut. There are some regional groups, the Farmington Valley Trails Council, which I ran for so many years, does a lot of this work and does it very well, and others. But I think that what you need to do if you're an individual or a small group of individuals, is cast around and look for who can point you in the direction of who you need to talk to, what steps are required to get a project to a point where, at the very least, it's actually a project. And then you can start to shop it for construction money and things like that. But as I said, it's quite a long process. It's a situation where I think people who have been there and done that really shine and can help other people.
What keeps you going to lead this work, bro?
You know what keeps me going, and it's probably the same damn thing that keeps you going after all these years, is seeing something built.
Yes, in the face of the opposition that I used to know, that's the reason I became a realtor, is because of all those antis I knew over the years. They told me that they were opposed to the trail because it was going to devalue their house so much they'd be upside down. So I became the first realtor in the United States specializing in this realm of selling houses near rail trails to prove it wrong. And so I do occasionally go to ribbon cuttings that I know had serious dead end or opposition there. And because I like to see who of the antis are going to be coming around later to say that. Occasionally there'll be one that has the courage to say that I was wrong and that trail has been a great thing for our community. And so that's why
I did a presentation in Bolton, Connecticut, which is along the Airline State Park Trail. And a woman came up to me that I recalled from a decade earlier. And she said, I'm paraphrasing her, but she said, I was wrong. And I got to tell you, that kind of makes all of the crap that we go through worth it.
That's right. That's right. I have this e-newsletter now that goes out to approaching 20,000 people, basically monthly. And a few years ago, I had a story in there, and there was actually two stories of about two opponents who were one in Maine and one in Eastern Massachusetts, who were both leaders in the fight against the rail trail in their communities. And they both lost, and the trail got built, and they both were had enough courage to admit that they love the trail now. And so there are stories out there, but it's not very common, but it's worth helping to find them and at least maybe outreach them later, because we all know who they are when they're opposed. And then when the trail gets built, we should outreach them, see what they think later.
The famous story, and it's really not apocryphal, it's actually a true story, is in Asbury. We built a berm with a towering closed fence on the top of it next to a condominium that had such vocal. They were so bad they actually filed a suit that kept us from building that trail for, I want to say, 6 years. I'm not going to mention any names, but
remember, I spoke to her.
Yeah, you probably did.
Yeah,
you probably did. Yeah, famous instance. Boy, not too long after that, area and another area in northern Farmington and an area in Avon They were chainsawing doors out of the fence to get to the trail. It's an absolutely true story. So it gives you an idea of people are going to come and steal our stuff. They're going to make a lot of noise.
Yeah.
They're going to, we've heard it all. I've actually had police chiefs come to a neighboring town where we're hearing that stuff and just come to a town committee meeting and talk about the fact that there's none of that. We see very occasional graffiti, some kids fooling around with stuff, but there's no real crime. It's something that just never happened.
Yep, the same experiences here. There's one odd thing though with this house where I'm sitting in here. Our house sits 8 feet from the trail, and the house was built in 1863, and a couple of years later, the railroad was built between our house and our neighbor, 8 feet away. It's actually one of the narrowest strips of railroad right-of-way in the United States. When the trail got built in 1982 to a completion, it was paved. It was one of the earliest rail trails in the Northeast. And just past November, almost a year ago now, they repaved it. First time it had been repaved in 42 years.
Wow, was it that long? Wow.
Yes. And it was very ragged. I'll send you a picture, Bruce, I sold a house recently to a woman who moved here from California. She wanted to live near a rail trail, and she started off as a bed and breakfast guest here, and then she evolved a couple of years later into buying here. She was so thrilled. She took a picture of her bike on the trail. It was in the early fall of last year, 2024. Right after that picture was taken, they came to repave it because it was all a little ragged around the edges and see cracks in her picture. She loved the trail, but looking at it, it was all cracked, looked like junk. And so when she sent me the picture after it was repaved, I said, I want you to redo that picture with a then and now because it's completely different. But when this came to scarify the pavement, to grind up the pavement, going by our house, this giant machine came by and it shook our house just like the railroad used to shake our house.
I'll bet it did, yeah.
And it's changed all of our paintings and art on the walls. I'll send you a picture of it. You'll get a kick out of it.
So what is that? What is that corridor next to your house? It's got to be half a rod. It's got to be what, 31 feet?
It's 20 feet wide.
20 feet. Wow, that's really narrow.
Yes. It's usually 66 feet wide.
Yeah, that's a rod, right? Yeah.
4 rods. And this is, matter of fact, I've got a complete set of valve maps of this corridor. I'll take a picture for you and I'll show you I got a little red rectangle on the staircase going upstairs. I have the valve maps of this corridor right next to our house here. And I'll tell you about how I obtained those some other time, but this is, you'll get a kick out of that. We're at our time to end here, and it went well. And there's a question here, where to find Bruce, or you can send us how you want to be notified by people who see the podcast and they'd like to talk to you. Maybe they contact me direct. I don't know, whatever you want. You can.
No, I think I routinely give out my corporate email, which is really simple. It's bruce@greenway.org.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I'm happy to hear from anyone. And give me a day or two. I'm busy as hell, as you can imagine, but I get back to everybody. And I'd love to hear from people.
All right.
Take care of yourself.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Roads Less Traveled with Craig Della Penna. I hope today's episode gave you fresh ideas and inspiration for exploring the unique world of real estate, rail trails, and bike tourism. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show so we can reach more trail lovers and real estate enthusiasts like you. Stay connected, stay curious, and I'll see you in 2 weeks with more expert insights and stories from the roads less traveled. Until then, keep exploring those hidden paths and uncovering new opportunities. Thanks.